Thank you for joining us this afternoon and welcome to our Oral History Questioning Techniques webinar. My name is Fran Stovold and I work for Sporting Heritage and I run their workforce development programme. So I run their webinars. We have a whole series of peer-to-peer networks, including a football one, in case you're interested in joining our football network, and also our annual conference, and I also do project work for them. For those of you who aren't familiar with what Sporting Heritage does, we are a subject specialist network and we provide support for any organisation that has a sporting collection, everything from your tiny table tennis club down the road through to museums, galleries, archives, libraries, universities, individual private researchers, national governing bodies of sport, anybody. We're a very, very broad church and we work across all 4 home nations. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce both Anita Broad and Dr. Gary James, who are with us this afternoon, and I'll let them do their own introductions in a moment. But I thought I'd start with a quick bit of housekeeping. We are recording the session, so not only so that we've got a legacy piece so that others can watch it going back, but so that we've also got a record of what we've talked about this afternoon. You are welcome to turn your cameras on, cameras off, whatever you're most comfortable with. There will be plenty of opportunity to chat and discuss, and as I say, you can do it with your camera on or off, whichever you prefer. There are closed captions enabled for the session, so if you find it easier to have closed captioning for when people are talking, you can click that on and off from your own control panel. And a quick thing on tech, since we've already had a few people drop in and out. If the tech fails at your end, please just log back in using the link that you had to get in originally, and I will keep an eye on the waiting room. If for any reason the tech glitches or fails at my end, I will contact everybody and let you know whether we can get up and running again within the time frame of this afternoon, or whether we need to reschedule to another time. So I think that's more or less everything I had to say. We've got 2 hours this afternoon. The rough timings were on the Eventbrite listing. One more person just to join us, Diana. But the timings are flexible. We definitely won't run over our 2 hours. Hopefully now we've got a nice full room, we should easily take up our 2 hours with all our chatting and activities. But the timings are flexible, but we will have a comfort break in the middle because otherwise everybody will be sliding off their chairs after 2 hours. So I think that's everything I was going to say. If I could hand over to Anita, do you want to start? And if you want to hand on to Gary, and then we'll do a quick once around the screen to introduce everybody. So Anita, over to you.
Yeah, hi, hello everybody. Thanks for coming. Really nice to see you. If anybody did feel like putting their cameras on, it's always really nice to talk to faces if we can, but you know, no problem if you don't. Yeah, so my name's Anita Broad and I'm an oral historian and I run oral history workshops for community groups, schools, adults, children, all sorts, all ages, all different reasons for being there. I also sit on the national governing body, Stovold, England. I'm also a Stovold coach and I play, and I'm a cricket coach. So I have all sorts of sort of angles on sport, and as a woman player, obviously I have that angle too. But yeah, so that's my background. I'm a Stovold player, sport player, I love sport, and I'm an oral historian. Over to you, Gary.
Okay, I'm Gary James. I'm a historian and writer. I've used oral history techniques and interviewing ever since I first started writing, really, which is a long time ago now. I've written about 20 books. I completed my PhD a few years back, and I've written a number of academic articles. Over recent years, my focus has been on women's football. I first attended my women's football game back in 1987-88 season. My girlfriend used to play, and I continue to be a regular. I'm hopeless at football myself, but I absolutely love football and sport, and love to research and write and uncover the history of the game, really, and give voice to people who perhaps their voices just haven't really been heard. So that's a brief introduction to me.
Lovely. And we'll come back and talk about, or get Gary to talk more broadly about his body of work in a moment. So it'd be great, just as I say, to do a once around the screen. So if you could just introduce the organisation that you are representing and talk about how your project is set up or is being set up for the oral history side, and any particular challenges that you think you might be facing, because I understand everybody's had oral history experience, but if there are particular challenges about interviewing sports people and footballers, obviously in link to the Euros. Melanie, do you want to go first? Oh, you're just on mute at the moment.
Do that every time. So yeah, I'm Melanie Jevons. My organisation is Living Archive, based in Milton Keynes, and we're a community archive. We've got a vast oral history collection, mainly filmed interviews, oral history interviews, photographs, film, that type of thing. And we have been tasked with doing the interviews for the Women's Euros in Milton Keynes. So we've identified a few people already. The women from the 1971 World Cup, the Mexican Games. So there's 3 women that live locally that we're going to interview for that, as well as we've got the MK Dons Stadium here, MK Dons women's teams. And I suppose my interest today is to find out, I mean, I have interviewed people. We did a rugby project, Rugby World Cup, and we interviewed some women rugby players. But I have no interest in football. I admit that straight away. So that would be my challenge, really. I mean, I've already sort of worked on some questions, but yeah, I don't know anything about football, so hence my reason for being here.
Well, hopefully we can show you some good tips and tricks of how to get into those sporting stories, even if you're coming from a non-sporting background. Jodie, do you want to go next?
Hi there, I'm Jodie from the Royal Pavilion and Museums Trust in Brighton and Hove, and I am curating an exhibition as part of Brighton's offer for the Euros called Goal Power Women's Football. And we're not doing sort of in-depth oral history so much, but I am talking to a lot of women from Brighton who played in the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, and they are part of the exhibition. So I'm interested, like Melanie. I have almost no football knowledge or background at all, but I'm very passionate about women in sport. But I guess, yeah, it's that how to approach it and what. Yes, and I guess if I'm not doing an in-depth oral history but an interview, how to approach that, and I mean, some of the women that I have been talking to can really talk, so it's a bit of advice as to how to frame it and how to keep it kind of contained beyond 4 hours kind of thing. So yeah, any advice on that too, please?
Lovely, I'm sure we can help on that front. Megan, do you want to go next?
Hi, yes, I'd be happy to. My name is Megan McGowan. I'm with the Trafford Local Studies Centre in Trafford. I'm the manager of the centre, which includes a local studies collection and an archive. We are one of the host cities for the Euros, and we are also facilitating an oral history program. We'll be hoping to speak and have in-depth conversations with retired footballers, but I'm hoping to expand the program a little farther so that we're able to create sort of conversations between retired footballers and current young women playing. We do have a few connections with local county teams, and it'd be really exciting to have some sort of techniques and ways to create access points and connections between those two groups. And then, of course, I'm sure that the skills that we'll learn here today will also help with the intergenerational work that we'll do throughout the rest of our heritage activities.
Lovely, thank you very much. Chris, do you want to go next?
Hi, so I'm Chris Evans and I work over in Rotherham. So we're again host city for the Heritage project, and I'm leading on the engagement for the project that'll work towards the exhibition that we'll be producing. So for me, I've been engaging with a lot of lovely footballers, mainly from the 70s and 80s. I've been having lots of conversations and building up to doing some oral history, but haven't done any yet. I've been trained on oral history, and we've got all the equipment, but I've never actually done it. I have to say, I do a lot of engagement, but I've kind of put oral history off. So it's kind of, I suppose what I'm after today is a little bit of confidence to like go and do it, how to sort of plan it. One of the things that really scares me is the fact that, because I do a lot of engagement work, it's how the process kind of works. Because obviously one of the things is kind of, because with engagement, you'll tend to ask a question, then somebody will ask something, and then you'll respond to it, and you can't necessarily do that in oral history. So how can we do that around the football particularly? And I think, as Jodie was saying, these ladies are really passionate, and that'll come across really well in the recordings, but they do tend to go off track quite a bit and talk about things you're not really expecting. So it's kind of how to bring that back and how to keep it structured while still making it feel informal. So yes, so quite a lot there. So I just need a lot of help.
That all makes sense. We have, as part of our Sporting Heritage webinar programme, Anita has run a couple of oral history webinars for us, which we've recorded that are on our YouTube channel. I'll put the links in the chat. There's one which talks about planning your oral history project. So that may give you a good sort of framework and checklist just to make sure that you've gone through everything that you need to go through. And the second one is about creative approaches to oral history interviews. So they might be either a good refresher if you're already trained, or maybe if you're more at the beginning like you are, Chris, maybe a good sort of few pointers just to, I say, build your confidence a little bit more. But I'll put the links in the chat. David, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Dave. I'm working with Chris in Rotherham. I am a community engagement freelancer, so I'm working with Chris to, I'm more reaching out to communities and young people. So yeah, oral history is something I've never really done before. So this is going to be a really good learning curve for me. And I think what Chris was saying, I come from a theatre background, so trying to think how these narratives fit within a bigger picture is really kind of where I'm really interested to get some guidance on. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm sure we can do that. And I know that in the conversations that myself and Gary and Anita have had in the run up to this session, we've been talking about how, the football stories link out to wider themes and, people's lives in general. So hopefully that will give you that sort of bigger picture that you're looking for. But if it doesn't, as we go through, do shout and we'll try and re-examine that. Gilly, you're next.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm from Archives, Wigan and Lee. We are hosting some games in the Lee side of things, so I'm excited to be a part of that. I am not an oral historian, I'm afraid, but we are in the process right now of employing one. So I'm here to kind of get some top tips and tricks, and I guess hear your guys' kind of problems or concerns, and kind of hopefully prevent any in advance for us. So yeah, excited to see what everyone kind of has to say.
Yeah, I've done it as well, Melanie. I've put myself on mute. Lovely, thanks, Gilly. Diana, last but by no means least.
Hi everyone. Hi. I'm Diana. I'm the archivist here at Brent Museum and Archives, and so obviously we've got Wembley here, so the final is being playing at Wembley, so there's very much a focus on on Wembley and the surrounding areas. So we're running an oral history project, which we've kind of gone for a contemporary collecting angle. So we're talking to young women and girls, kind of part of kind of football teams in the area, and I think that kind of fulfills the contemporary collecting angle in terms of the gaps in our collections. And so we're actually working with the University of Campus of Business Football, who are based at Wembley, and they're broadcasting students, and they're going to be conducting the oral histories with us, and via Zoom. So I'd kind of like tips, I guess, how to kind of create that sort of rapport, you know, that you don't get, I guess, virtually. Yeah, and I mean, this is my first oral history project as well, so it would be really great to kind of learn from the oral historians, and yeah, so that's why I'm here today.
Lovely, thanks, Diana. So there's quite a breadth in everybody's projects between rich sound bites, which I think, Jodie, is what you're looking for your exhibitions. We've got archive material, it sounds like, for Melanie, and then more sort of community-based stuff. We've got intergenerational conversations, I think, that Megan was talking about. You've obviously got contemporary collection at your end, Diana. So there's quite a spread. So we will try our best to cover all the angles in what we're going to cover today. So I thought we'd kick off with getting Gary to talk about his body of work. Because we're quite a small group, if you've got a question as we're going through, if you just want to raise your hand, and we'll just pause and do questions as we're going along, or if you get a burning, you know, a whole stack of questions or something bigger, we can do a sort of Q&A at the end. But I thought it might be quite nice, as we're quite a small group, to do it as we're going along. So Gary, can I hand back to you? And do you want to talk about your body of work, and particularly, you know, your work with Manchester City Women?
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, I've been performing interviews, oral history interviews, ever since I first started researching and writing, really. And my research initially was focused on newspapers and printed sources and so on. But I soon realised that when you're talking about something like football, which, you know, most of my writing has been about football, if you like, certainly me factual writing. It's a lively sport. It's a visual sport. It's something that people can get excited about. It's something that people get enthusiastic about. And quite often, a newspaper, even a match report from a newspaper, cannot capture the feelings, the interest, and so on. So from the beginning, really, I started to interview people, footballers, but also football supporters, football managers, football coaches, referees, all sorts of people involved with the game, and try and develop that. Now, it was interesting that a few of you said that you've got no interest in football, you've no experience of football. Well, you know, I am a football fan, but I cannot play football. I really can't. I've never been in any kind of team apart from, well, not even at school. So the challenges of doing an interview when you've not got practical experience of scoring a goal, of making a great save, of crossing the ball, of whatever it may be, I can understand how that can be something that people are nervous about or fearful of. But to be honest, that's not really different to any other interview that might be performed. You know, if you think about television, you know, Jonathan Ross or Graham Norton or whatever, they've not got experience of everything that the people they're interviewing have done over the years, and so they just need those questions to actually open up those guests and open up the interviewees and so on. And that's the same with football or any other activity. So from early days, I recognised the value of that, and I had oral history training and so on from the Oral History Society, and I would strongly advise people to look at the Sporting Heritage webinars, because there are some great tips on there. About 5 years ago, I devised a project working with Manchester City Football Club, which was to capture the stories of the women who played for that football club. Now, one of the reasons why we did this was that the club was joining the Women's Super League, and was a perception, it relaunched as Manchester City Women. It had previously been called Manchester City Ladies, and there's a perception that this was a new club by the world, really. And that upset many of the women who had been involved with that football club prior to that period. And it had it was formed in 1988, so it's a 30-year existence. So I set up this project and with Manchester City, and the idea really was to try and capture those voices and those stories, and really develop that history of that club, so that we knew it. Now, obviously, when you're doing any kind of interview, you're capturing one story. You're not interviewing everybody that's been involved with a club. So we knew from the start we couldn't get every angle, every story, every moment, but we knew we would get enough to fill the gap, because, as most of you will find out if you're not already aware, when you're dealing with women's football, it's not always appeared in the newspapers. It's not always received coverage. Even when it has appeared in newspapers, quite often it's an angle that perhaps doesn't do the sport the justice it deserves. And so the idea of the project really was to bring those voices and to get those stories and to try and make sure that we were all fully aware, including the football club itself, who wasn't, the club was not aware of its own history. And so that project, well, there was a few stop starts with it, but it took a good couple of years. And then out of that project, the output really was to develop an archive at Manchester City, which would be a sound archive of those interviews, but also alongside that, an archive of objects, an archive of images, and I create a book as well. That's the book, which is basically, there it is as well, which is basically the stories of those women and some men who were involved in the club, obviously, because there were some coaches, there were supporters, there were other people involved, referees and so on. It's a story of that club using their voices, not really being critically analysed by me in any shape or form, but talking around themes. So some of the themes, for example, and I would suggest these are the same sorts of things that maybe you want to tackle in your individual projects, but themes like school, family, clothing, football kit, social life, friendships, relationships, those sort of themes. So not just purely about kicking a football. And for me, any oral history project really isn't specifically about that one aspect. That's just a link. So for me, yes, there may need to be some discussion about football, but football is the vehicle to try and get all of those other stories, all of those other links. It was mentioned before about perhaps bringing players from different generations together. Great idea, because that actually allows you to do comparisons, and in the same way as we might compare changing transport or anything else from a society point of view. It's a great way of doing that. But it is those stories. It's about, how did you get to the football game? How did who washed the kit? Who did you get paid? Did you pay somebody to play? How did the club survive? Who created the club? Those sort of things, for me, particularly with the Manchester City women. I mean, we talked about Manchester City women, but it was actually a history of those women's experiences of football, and the link was Manchester City. So some of them talked about playing football in the 1960s and early 1970s. The club wasn't created until 1988, but that was important to them. It was important in their journey. So as the person doing the interviews, I have to say, I always got an awful lot out of every single interview. I don't mean in terms of material, but in terms of satisfaction, in terms of actually feeling that you've given somebody the opportunity to talk about their life, but also you yourself have learned something, you've gained something. And I think, I know it wasn't about me, if you like, but I think that's something we should all look forward to, if you like, that you will get the opportunity to hear some stories and to hear something that you just perhaps couldn't even contemplate. And I think that's great. And what I found as well was that many of the people who were interviewed were just delighted, as a few of you have said, to tell their story. And it was difficult at times to sort of make sure you could keep focused on what you needed to stay focused on. But to be frank, quite often when people did go off at a tangent, again, some of the best material came out of that. So it may be that you have a series of questions, and every time I did an interview, I did a semi-structured interview, in as much as I'd have a series of points that I wanted to get across, you know, I wanted to find out about, but I wasn't afraid to let those themes develop. So, for example, I might have said, how did you get to the game? How did you get there? And somebody might have started to talk about how, you know, an uncle used to take them to the game. They had a car, they drove to the game, they travelled for 2 hours to get there. It was the other side of the city, or whatever it may be. And they'd start telling this, and then they'd spend some time talking about how this uncle may have encouraged them to play football, which wasn't something that was my specific question, but it was appropriate, and you get more information. So I'm conscious that I've just talked quite a bit there about that. I'm more than happy to answer questions, or I'm more than happy for us to sort of delve into specific areas. But as a bit of an overview, what I would say is it's hugely satisfying to do interviews like this. Don't be afraid of football. I don't think there would be anyone being interviewed who would expect the interviewer to know about the offside rule, you know, which is the example that people often give, you know, or what it's like to score a goal. But what I think people being interviewed would want is, if they describe scoring a goal, then obviously as the person doing the interview, you would need to sort of say, well, how did you feel, or show some emotion, or show some interest, you know, great interest, not move straight onto another question, to sort of keep it within that theme. I've just seen a question coming up. What would you suggest as a time limit for an interview? There's going to be pressures on each of you, but I would say, I personally, I like to do around about, well, between 30 minutes and 1 hour for each interview. Sometimes you might need to do a follow-up interview as well if you're getting somewhere, but you know, you can find that the first sort of 10 minutes can be sort of warming up really and getting into the subject. And you always know when it's going on too long. You always know that, but it is more about not setting a specific time limit, but being aware from the start, saying I'm expecting this to take, you know, up to an hour or whatever time, and setting the tone, if you like, and setting the agenda for what's going to happen. Because there'd be nothing worse than to talk for 2 hours and somebody expected to leave after 35 minutes or whatever.
I think as well, when you're planning your interview, you know, plan for around about an hour, because usually people will start to flag. I mean, I know some of you have got people that like to talk and want to keep talking, but if you give them an idea that we're going to talk for an hour and we're going to talk about this, we're going to talk about things around this subject. So you give them an idea of what you want to talk about. But, you know, just like Gary says, if they do go off on a little tangent, let them go until you know that it's not what you want to talk about. And then kind of rein them in and say, oh, if we could just go back for a minute to talking about what it was like to score that goal. But be careful not to miss things, because like Gary was saying, sometimes the best content comes out of something you're really not expecting. And so, yeah, I would say aim for about an hour. You'll know immediately if the person wants to talk or they really don't want to talk. But yeah, around about an hour is good before they start getting tired and it flags and you know, gets not what you want it to be. I think Megan's got a hand up.
Yeah. Yes, sorry, I was on and off with the hand up for a minute there. Would you then recommend if, so Trafford will be hopefully collecting some of the interviews that that we produce as well. Would you then recommend fewer but longer interviews that have kind of more quality than, say, shorter interviews that, or more interviews but shorter interviews, if that makes sense? So
quality not quantity.
Yeah.
From my point of view, it depends on what you want. You know, if you're gathering stories, like I think Jodie was looking for sort of sound bites, so it might be that Jodie would have shorter interviews. If you're doing it for a community exhibition, you might want more. And once you start your interview, you'll know what they've got to give you, and you'll be able to tell. But again, it's always about what do you want the interview for. So if it was a full-on academic oral history study, then you would be doing hours upon hours upon hours, and you would go back and you would interview again and again and again, and you would do a complete oral history study. If what you're looking for is exhibition pieces or excerpts for a website or something for a banner or an exhibition, you want those to be able to pull out those little bits of story that work for what you want it for. So if you're just doing it for exhibitions, and so we call it oral history, but in fact it's more about memory gathering if you're talking about shorter interviews and reminiscences. So as in one of my webinars, I think it was the planning one, it talks about know what you want your interviews for. And if you want them, for example, to take sound bites, to take clips, then I know we're not going to be doing sort of techniques of oral history interviewing today, because that's a different subject altogether. But don't interrupt. If they're speaking, try to do non-verbal nodding and smiling and those sort of things, because you might have a lovely story and you don't want to be in the middle of it going, oh yeah, that was great, I remember that, because that will spoil your soundbite. So as with any oral history interview, step back, listen, do lots of nodding, and you know, you can perfect your silent laughing as well, sort of without actually making a sound on the recording, because then you've got edit points, and you know, you're able to pick pieces out that you can use. Chris has got a hand up.
Hiya. So quite a lot of my ladies are like part of families, so they've asked to bring maybe their dad that started off the football with them and their sisters. So I'm feeling like I might need to do a group interview. Do you think that'll work for oral history purposes?
I don't know, Gary, what do you think?
Well, I was going to say I had a very similar experience in that sometimes somebody wants to bring somebody else along, maybe for a confidence point of view, or to make sure that other person gets their story out there. I preferred one-to-one, but as it was the only way to get some interviews done, then yes, it was absolutely right. It causes one or two issues in terms of the recording and the logistics, because, for example, if you then decide you're going to transcribe the interviews later, you need to make sure you can recognize those voices. I did an interview with two sisters who sounded virtually the same. It was difficult, but we got there in the end. I would say that if it's the only way you can do an interview with the person you really want to do an interview, then yes, go for it, do it. You do find occasionally that doing an interview with a couple of people, or I try to avoid doing more than two people, but if you've got a couple of people in the room, might be good, because one can give the other person confidence, one might remember something, so that might be useful. But I would suggest you try not to do it if you can. It's only really if it's going to get somebody in the room who won't come in the room otherwise.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Gary there. If it's the only way of doing it, yes, do a group. And you know, it does cause problems because of miking and that sort of thing, although you know the recording equipment that you'll probably be using will pick up everybody. But what you find, so there's pros and cons, there's always pros and cons, aren't there? The pros might be, as Gary said, that one will spark off the other, but you'll find that they know what each other is talking about, so they won't give you as full a description as they might have done if they were alone. So they'll be having a chat, and it'll be, you know, you could get really nice stuff, you could get really nice interesting pieces, and it's worth trying. Transcription is a nightmare, as Gary says, and with oral history interviews you usually would be expected to do a transcription of your interview. So yeah, pros and cons. It can help, it can help people's memories because they're sparking off each other, but equally they will just chat to each other, know what they're talking about, and you won't get such a full description usually. But if it's the only way of doing it and they will only do it that way, then obviously that's the only way of getting it.
If it works out that logistically two people want to come together, then perhaps say to them, well, can we do 30 minutes with you and 30 minutes with you, so we do it separately? Because there's nothing worse than being in a room and one of them will say, oh, remember such and such, and the other one will go, oh, that was hilarious, oh, that's great. And then you're saying, well, what happened? And we say, oh, you had to be there. You know,
yeah, whereas, that doesn't help.
Whereas individually, one of you might say, make sure you ask such a body about that time when, and then, you know, it can come out.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, also you'll find that one person will talk more than the other. So you have to be really careful to draw that other person in, because one will rely on the other, or one will talk over the other. You know, there's pros and cons. There's no absolute there, I'm afraid. Except that in an oral history interview, if it was a proper academic oral history project, you would do one-to-one.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help? Sorry, Chris.
It might be quite challenging to start off with a couple to start with, because it is the logistics and the managing of people and briefing them so they don't talk over each other and so they explain things fully. Otherwise, as Gary and Anita were saying, you sort of get those in jokes or those in, you know, the sort of understandings where you don't finish things off. Melanie, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we've recently just done this where we interviewed some architects, and some of them haven't seen each other for like 40 years. And we sort of set it all up on the same day that they would come at different times for the interviews. But then we sort of thought, actually, they were all chatting to each other, and we made a film about, you know, the whole lot of them. And we just thought it'd be really nice for them to sit and talk to each other. So we did let them do that, and we just filmed them. So we took them aside and said, right, we'll do your interview separately. And then afterwards, we sort of said to them that we'd really like you to all chat together. We gave them a few sort of questions, sort of a bit of a framework, but it worked really nicely in the film to sort of see them all talking afterwards. So I think I'm going to do that with these 3 football ladies, because obviously they all played in the same team. So I'm going to interview them all separately, but I do want to film them all together as this sort of reunion type thing, to put in the film, the final film. So yeah, it is difficult to manage, and yeah, I do agree the transcribing is a nightmare. But
that idea though works really well, because I've just well, it was in December, I did an event where we actually it turned out we had about 6 women who'd played football, but 3 had played together, 2 had played together. So we did the Jonathan Ross, Graham Norton interview where we actually got them up on stage, we sat them down. I'd already previously interviewed each one of these women to talk about their own careers, so I knew the topics to bring up. And so as an event, as a sort of engagement event where perhaps you've got an audience or you've got them talking or you're going to film it, that's great. But specifically for the interviews, you do them separately, and then maybe get them together, and it creates a great event.
Yeah, so the group discussion is a group discussion that you filmed rather than an oral history which you've recorded. So both work really well and really good for, you know, website content and exhibition content and all of those things. But just be careful that you do get the sort of person-to-person interviews as well, because that, you know, then it's an oral history interview. We had a question, a comment from David in the chat. It feels like the human condition is more central than the football itself. And that goes back to something that I was going to address, that it really doesn't matter quite so much as you might think that you know lots about football. And Gary touched on this as well. You don't need to be a football expert. What you need to know about is the person you're interviewing. So obviously, when you're doing a project, an oral history project, you do your research. You have to research and know about your club, the history of your club, the women that you're going to be interviewing. You need to know about them so that you can ask informed questions. But you don't need to know the specifics necessarily of how football is played, because you're finding out from them what you want to know. And they're going to be explaining to you. And in some ways, there's the insider-outsider interviewing dynamic. So if you know everything there is to know about football and the person that you're interviewing and your friends, and you know them and you've talked to them before, they will always assume that you know what they're talking about. And they'll say, oh yeah, you remember when we did that, you know, that thing. And you remember what happened. And you'll then have to say, yeah, but I want you to tell me. So if you're an outsider outside of that group, then you're able to ask questions and get them to explain things in a way that they have to give you a fuller description. And that's what you're looking for, really full descriptions of how it felt, how it smelt, what the sound was like, how did the excitement build, and how did you feel, all of those things, depending on what you're talking about, obviously, and asking them about. But sometimes being an outsider, not knowing, but having done your research so you can ask informed questions, does help to get a more insightful interview, because you don't know what they're talking about and they have to tell you, and that's what you want from them. So Dave, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that inside or outside, because we talked about it, and I thought it particularly pertinent that you can make almost your lack of knowledge about the game as it becomes a strength, because you are putting them in the position. And it's quite nice when you go in as an interviewee, if any of you've ever been interviewed as an oral history, to go in knowing that you are the one who knows all about this topic and your interviewer necessarily doesn't. So you're going in as the expert, and that's a lovely position to be in. You don't want to go in and, you know, you go in and you're being interviewed for a job and you feel like you're not the expert at all, and you feel nervous and on the back foot. But if you put them at their ease, and you know you are after their knowledge and their experience, that's a quite a nice dynamic to be in.
But you do need to have done your research about them, so that when they answer a question and you're listening carefully, and as Gary was saying, you know, you'll be hearing this. And even though you've got, and we're going to talk about interview guides later, I think, but even though you've got your list of questions, you must be listening to what they are saying, so that if they say something that isn't on your interview guide, that wasn't quite what you were going to talk about, but gosh, is that interesting? I really need that bit of information. You need to have the knowledge, the background knowledge and the research to be able to say, that's really interesting. Yes, I heard about so and so and so and so. Can you tell me a bit more about what happened then? And that might take you on a completely different line to what you had imagined you were going to ask about. You know, it needs to be what you're looking for, but be informed, but you don't need to be an expert. Do your research, know about the person and know about what it is you're going to ask, but you don't need to be that expert.
And a great example of how it can sort of go off down a different pattern, really, or a different pathway, is that I did an interview with a player who played for Manchester Corinthians in the 1960s, and she one of the sort of standard questions, if you like, I used to ask was, and where did you get your kit from? What about your football boots? And she then told this story about how she went to get her football boots, and when she went into the shop, she had to pretend they were for her brother, because if a woman went into a sports shop back in the 1960s and said she wanted a pair of football boots, they wouldn't sell them, because why would a woman want football boots, was the response, if you like. So she had to actually pretend they're for her brother, who just happened to have the same size feet as she did. So that then raises all sorts of other questions, which obviously, hopefully you'll all get in some way. But it's not a question specifically about playing football, but it is a question about, how did you get your kit? How did you get your football boots? What happened about football shirts? Who washed them? It's those sort of questions, and they perhaps tell a lot more than what type of footballer were you, which is the sort of question that I think people automatically assume they are going to ask, when realistically it doesn't matter whether somebody played on the wing or whether somebody was a centre forward. Or it's interesting and it adds something, but they're not the sort of questions I think that we want to get out with this project, because somebody will say, oh yeah, I was an attacking winger. It's not a story, is it, really?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. When you explore themes around women's sport and women's football in particular here, all sorts of things will come out. If you're talking about, these days we take it for granted that our football teams, our women's teams in whatever sport, will be doing training. They'll have coaches. Did they have training? Did they have coaches? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. That's the kind of thing. There's also the social history around it. So if they had to go to training, let's say they did have training, it might just have been a kickabout practice. But let's say they did go to training. How did they get there? What did they do to prepare to get there? Did they have to leave their husband's tea on the stove? Who looked after the kids? What were their lives like around their sport? So when you're doing your exhibitions, your curations for your museums, your websites and newsletters, whatever it is, think about what your project is about. Is it about the women, or is it about football? And I would suggest it's about the women who played football. It's, I don't know what you're doing, but it's about those women's lives and how they came to be playing. What got in their way? When they got married, did they have to give up playing? Questions like that, and some of the themes that you might be exploring, training and coaching, their match day routine. What if they had a game and it was an away game? What, did they all go on a coach together? Did they have to book their own coach? Did they go on train? Who knows? And it's not just players, remember. You might be interviewing fans, you might be interviewing players, officials, all sorts of people. There's support staff, that, like Gary was saying, people that washed the kit. What happened? It came back and it was filthy. Did they hang it on the washing line? And I think Gary's got a good story about a washing line.
Yeah, actually, it was an interesting one, really. That so I did it was Manchester City. So obviously there are two teams in the two major men's teams in the Manchester area: Manchester City, Manchester United. Almost everyone who played for Manchester City women's team either supported City or United, but they didn't. Just because they played for City didn't mean they were Manchester City supporters. They just wanted to play football. So, that's the way it went. And they took turns to wash the kit. So, I asked this question, and one of the women I was interviewing was a Manchester United fan who actually lived virtually next door to Manchester United men's ground, Old Trafford. And when it was her turn to wash the kit, she took it home. She didn't think anything about it. Her mum washed the kit because her mum was the one who, she was living at home. Her mum was doing the washing. Her mum washed the kit. She hung it all out to dry, not realising the men's team, Manchester United men's team, was playing that day. And on the washing line were 11 Manchester City football shirts. So you can imagine the abuse that house got. And when the girl who'd been playing came home and she said, "Mum, what are you doing?" And that story came straight out of, what did you do about washing your kit? And it's great. And I think people, for women particularly, playing football throughout the decades and up until recent years has been difficult sometimes. Questions, simple questions like, how did you find out about the team? How did you find out there was a women's team near you? Because some people just, one of the women I interviewed was just walking through a park one day, saw women playing football and thought, I'd like to do that. I didn't know women had teams, and that's how she found out. Others saw adverts in Shoot magazine and things like that. So we're reading what is ostensibly a boys' football magazine, reading that and see a small letter or something that says, we're creating a women's team in, and it doesn't matter where it is, but that's how she found out. So those questions for me, if I was doing a project on men and playing football, then I'd still ask a lot of these same sort of questions. There wouldn't be, but the bottom line is that society was geared around men playing football from an early age. School teams for a lot. For most of the women, there wasn't a school football team, even up until recent years. Some of the biggest stars currently playing for England, I've interviewed a few of them, and some of them talk about how they received abuse off teachers in some cases. Why would a girl play football? So there's those sort of questions. Did you receive support from family? Did you receive support from teachers? Did you receive hostility? They're the sorts of questions. And I think at the end of it, everyone will be amazed at the sort of material that comes out of this. But I also think it's going to paint a picture across the country. Each region there's going to be stories that are going to be different from region to region, but there will be some themes that from a national point of view, we can say, well, this project brought out all this information and it'll be fantastic.
I think picking up on that and picking up what Chris has just put in the chat, talking about those challenges, particularly for those of you who are interviewing women from sort of the 70s and the 80s, you think the FA ban was only lifted in 71. They will have grown up not being able to play football in the way that men of their generation will have. As Chris has said, many of the women that she's going to be interviewing created their own teams. So there's all those sort of challenges to talk about. And I know Megan's had to leave us, but there's that contrast between, it might come up with your material actually, Diana, if you're interviewing players today, how you do that sort of compare and contrast, and have things really changed, or are women still having to create these opportunities for themselves? Do you have to be paying football at an elite level for it to have changed significantly? It'd be interesting to see how that grassroots approach to football, there's a lot of sort of talk about supporting girls football, and there's lots of sort of campaigns, but actually when you talk to people who are actually playing it, is the person who washes the kit, the person who is still the same person who makes the sandwiches, might still be the team captain. Because women's football is resourced and supported in a different way, you don't have individual people to do all those jobs. Lots of people may still do multiple jobs, partly for the love of the sport, but also partly because there isn't that sort of wealth of people to do it. So it's looking at those sort of comparisons that I think would be really useful to cover.
Yeah, and I think it was Diana was saying that they're doing taking a contemporary angle, and I think that was a really nice compare and contrast by interviewing women players now who will be the history of what we're tomorrow. You see what I mean? They if you make interviews with them, you can compare it to the women that you've also interviewed. Quite aside from oral history now, it would be nice to do a sort of reminiscence group meetup with older players and younger new players, and just for them to chat about their experiences and what it's like now and what it was like then, because a lot of young players will not have that perspective. But that's quite aside from oral history. That's another thing, reminiscence work. But but interviewing young players now and finding out the similarities. If you've already interviewed a player from the 70s, you'll be informed about what you might say to a young player now, and find out the differences of, it might be the same. They might have the same sort of barriers, depending what level they're playing at. And I know for Jodie, because I live nearby, you've got Lewis ladies football team. You'll know all about them, I'm sure. But what they're doing for women's equality is amazing. So there will be ways of comparing and contrasting there. I know it's not Brighton and Hove Albion, but it's still very local. You know, so there's a whole wealth of stuff that you can address there. The whole themes of LGBTQIA plus issues as well. That's a whole nother theme, you know, because did women talk about those things then? Probably not, but we don't know unless we ask them. I'm making an assumption. I have no idea. It's a tricky one. You know, you're going to have to be very careful when you talk about it with the women, but they may just say it, you know. But if you're going to explore those themes and all sorts of themes around the women players, there's all sorts of issues and themes that you can address. Changing rooms, there's another one. Did they even have changing rooms? Might not have. You know, some women's sports teams now don't have changing rooms, or don't bother to get changed because it's too horrible. Find out what the changing rooms were like. What songs did they sing? There might have been songs, you know, chants, football chants. There usually is. There usually is. What language?
And how rude they are.
Yeah, and how rude they are. Yeah. You know, what language? What was the footballing language like for women's teams? So there you go. All sorts of different things that you can talk about. We may have gone off track there. See, I do that too.
No. I was going to pick up on a couple of things that you've mentioned. Just talking about, I suppose it's also being very conscious that even if you're talking to somebody who's very knowledgeable about their, or, you know, talks very confidently about their playing experience, as with all things, it is just one person's perspective. So you can gather other people's perspective on that same match or on that same team. You know, people will come at it from all sorts of different perspectives depending on their role. You know, a terrible pun, I won't make the terrible pun that football's game is too hard, but obviously if you interview, you know, if a match is two opposing teams, so it may be that in your interviews you may find that your team has played against somebody else from one of the host nations. It might be host cities rather. So it may be worth trying to see if you can pair up and get those two different perspectives on that match. And it may happen that way. So I don't know if you're all part of a sort of a peer network, so you can share contacts like that. But it would be great to have, you know, the winners and the losers, or, you know, just two perspectives on, you know, that particular penalty or the foul, or, you know, what the ground was like, you know, because obviously the quality of the ground was very different. We did do in the autumn of last year, Sporting Heritage interviewed Laurie Hoey, who was one of the Fulham women's, one of the FA Cup winning teams, because it's been 50 years since the first FA Cup final. And I'll put the link to her recorded webinar in, because there's a really nice in-conversation piece within that section between Laurie and Chris Slegg, who is a BBC sports interviewer, and she talks about her experience of just wanting to play as a woman, and just there were no other nuances. She just wanted to play, so she didn't care what people said. They just found a way to play. And then when you see some of the coverage around the FA Cup match, it throws a real lens on sort of the sexism and misogyny of the time. You'll have to watch it and see some of the comments that some of the male commentators make about women playing football, and they talk about a particular black and white photograph of a teammate of hers who was asked to put lipstick on, you know, for the purposes of the photograph, and she's like, well, I don't wear lipstick, so no, and she stood her ground. But it was just those perceptions of even then. And I mean, I know it's still happening now in sport. You know, women should be looking attractive and, you know, appealing when they're playing sport. And, you know, we really haven't changed that far. When you think about what happened with it, was it the Norwegian handball team who were penalised for not wearing their tiny
beach volleyball?
Yeah, they're not wearing their tiny bikini knickers instead of more practical shorts. They were fined quite a lot.
And it's interesting with those topics, because you know, I ended up with the City Women. They got quite a lot of newspaper coverage back in the 80s, 90s and so on. But it was often headlines, like there was one which said, ladies strip for City. And it was basically, they got a new football kit. So the headline was ladies strip for City. But the connotations of all of that, what does that mean? And so it ended up, it was a theme that we discussed. And the whole idea really was that for some of the women, they didn't, at the time, they didn't think anything of it because that's the way society was. And so they were just pleased to get newspaper coverage. But looking back on that now, a completely different view. So there would be interesting aspects there. And particularly if somebody's doing interviews with current players or current teams, be interesting to perhaps show them some of the headlines from the past and just see what kind of reaction, as well as obviously showing the players that it was about. But yeah, it is interesting, and those sort of themes are absolutely vital, I would say.
Really important where you put that apostrophe. Yes. Ladies strip.
Yeah, definitely. And yes, and I don't know. I know we sort of touched on it already, but I don't know whether you want to tell the story that you told us, Gary, about I don't want to give it too much away, but the lady who was making food for her family.
Oh yeah.
Before going to.
Yeah, so actually she was captain of the team, and I asked what was a typical Sunday, because we played on Sundays, what was a typical Sunday like? And she said that she was absolutely determined that her playing football would not get in the way of family life. Whereas her husband could play football and that wouldn't be seen as an issue, her playing football, she did not want it to be seen as an issue. So typically on a Sunday morning, she would get up at whatever time and cook the Sunday lunch at say 8 in the morning, make sure it's all cooked, and then she'd go and play football. If it was an away game, obviously the game might be at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, so she'd be out for most of the day. And when she got back, she'd warm it up and eat it, because as far as she was concerned, her playing football was something she wanted to do, and her family should not suffer. And as a mother, her role was such. Now, I'm sure there'll be people with lots of different views, but it's not. If you're used to interviewing, say, men in football roles, or if you're used to interviewing men or women maybe in a different role, that idea that because she's playing football, she still has to keep the tradition of the family and what the family does on Sunday, it's unique to women, isn't it? It's not, and it may not be that somebody else feels like that anyway, but they're really important stories, and they say so much about the position of women's football, but also about how much she wanted to play as well, in another way, because she was convinced that nothing could stop her from doing it, if you like, as well, and didn't want to give her husband an excuse. I think they got divorced after that, but didn't want to give her husband an excuse, really.
Yeah, and that's not unique to football either. I've interviewed women playing other sports, my sport in particular, because I did some oral histories for Stovold, but same thing. They would have an evening game, they would put their husband's tea on the hob with a plate over it to keep on the Arga or Rayburn or whatever, to keep it warm, because they felt that was their duty, and they felt that they had to do that before they left. But nothing was going to stop them playing, but they made sure everything was prepared and ready before doing it. So it's not unique to football, but perhaps it's unique to women.
And in a similar sort of area, really, obviously, for a lot of these women, particularly the ones who perhaps had to travel some distance or played internationally, they usually ended up either having a full-time job or a part-time job, or they were housewives or whatever. But did they talk with their employer about playing football? And some of the women I've interviewed in the past would never tell their employer because they didn't want to give them a particular perception, which they may have given them. You need to explore that in your interview when that's said, obviously. But and others actually ended up, featured in the staff magazine, and got lots of support. Some got time off work. Some of the Corinthians from Manchester had to leave their jobs because they were going on tour to play football. Some of the women who played for England in the early years, in fact, up until recent times, would have had to either take time off work or whatever. And some of the women I've spoken to said every day's holiday was for football. Yeah. So if she's playing away on a Wednesday night, she takes a day off.
Yeah, and they probably had to pay for their travel, pay for their kit, pay for their stay. They were probably paying to play, and that's another really interesting avenue to explore. Can I just quickly say about Zoom, Fran?
Yes, do you want to do that, and then we'll stop for a comfort break?
Yeah, it's only very quickly. I forget who it was said now that they were going to be doing some Zoom. Was it Chris and Dave? Can't remember. Some interviews on Zoom. If you can avoid it, please avoid it. If there's no other way of doing it, do it. There's some really useful information on the Oral History Society YouTube channel and their website, but they go into detail on the YouTube channel about interviewing remotely, because of course during COVID you couldn't do face-to-face interviews, and that was the only way. Their advice was try not to, but of course if it is the only way of doing it, if you've got someone who lives abroad and they can't get here and that is the only way of doing it, your problem is the quality of the sound. The quality of the recording is never going to be as good. And if you are ever going to be archiving the material, you need to find out from your archivist what format they want it in, because it won't be in a WAV file. But as I say, if it is the only way of doing it, do it. Avoid it at all costs if you can. There is information about remote interviewing on the Oral History Society YouTube channel, which is brilliant.
I'm just going to put the link in the chat because they've got a whole playlist about remote interviewing. But yeah, it is difficult to pick up on the nuances, but yes, if that's the way your project's set up, then yeah, it's trying to elicit the most out of it. I suppose just sort of expanding on that a little bit, Anita, it's allowing people more time. I suppose it may take you longer because of the pauses, because you can't tell when people are going to stop and start. You don't see those sort of invisible cues that you do when you're in the room with them. So it's allowing people that extra time to sort of expand, and it is harder to build the rapport. So it's just something to consider, isn't it? So yeah, there's the link to the Oral History Society playlist about remote interviewing. So I think we've covered quite a lot of ground in that first hour. Let's take a comfort break. So as I say, we covered quite a lot of ground, and I hope that gave you some good ideas and sort of ways into getting your interview started and sort of eliciting some of those really rich stories that aren't, as I think, as Gary pointed out, aren't always, you know, the nuts and bolts of football, but they are so much about the heritage of football without it being the technical, you know, offside rule, you know, linesman, who won, who lost, you know, all those sort of stats, you know, because you can find that out from, you know, many other sources. It's those personal sort of recollections that you're looking for, isn't it? So the second hour, or 45 minutes we sort of got left, is going to be thinking about how you actually prepare for your interviews now. So we've talked broadly around the subject. As we touched on when we started, you're all collecting memories for slightly different end projects. Some of you have got people lined up. I hope that some of you, if you haven't got interviews already lined up, you know the sort of people you might be interviewing, or who your dream interviewees might be. So if we just have a sort of a 5-minute discussion before we go into sort of breakout rooms where we do a little bit of interview practice. What do people do? I shall throw it out to the room. What do people do before they go off for an oral history interview? What sort of preparation and practice, or, you know, prep do you do? Who's going to start? Go on, Melanie.
Yeah, I would probably just ring the person up and just have a sort of pre-interview chat, really, which is what I've done with these ladies, or one of the ladies from the football team, and then a bit of Google research as well as to what was going on, and just a bit, you know, a bit of background for my own confidence, I suppose. You know, I mean, like I say, I said at the beginning, I'm not really interested in football, and I don't see that as a problem in some ways, because like you said before, sometimes it's better not to know about things so that you can get a better answer out. But you know, I don't want to end up not knowing things that, you know, I might, if they mention something, I'd like to be able to know, oh yes, that was in 1969, or that was a great football match or something. So yeah, just about preparing yourself. But it, you know, it can take time as well. That's the other thing. You know, we're on quite a limited budget on this one. It's not really our project. We've been commissioned by Milton Keynes Council, so I'm aware that I want to I don't want to spend as much time as I perhaps normally would on one of our own projects to get that information. So we have been contacting Jean, the football historian. I don't know if other people, I know she's around for people on the project, to sort of feed people into us, because just having a brief, a call out for people, we want to make sure we get the interesting stories and not just somebody's, oh yeah, I play football on Saturday, but that's about it. It's about getting those really rich stories, I think.
Yeah, those people that, just play football on a Saturday, without talking to them though, you don't know what else they've got. Yeah. But of course, if you're limited on the number of interviews that you can do, that you're allowed to do, that your budget allows for, knowing those people really helps. What you have to be careful of is that it's not the same people that have been interviewed umpteen times before, because all you're going to get is the same story trotted out over and over again. So find out a little bit, if you can find people that haven't been interviewed before, those voices that haven't been heard, that's always so much better, because those stories will already be out there. The ones that get interviewed, they get rolled out on local telly all the time, and all of those.
I think I'm aware of that with these three ladies, but Milton Keynes Council are very keen that we do them. But we've got a woman referee lined up. We've got another lady who's played for MK Don's football team, and another lady who's played for about 20 years in local teams. So I think we've got a wide spread, and I think I'm going to interview my own granddaughter, because she plays football at school, and I really want to get a little girl, because they play with boys and girls, and they don't see any barrier to it at all. So I think it'd be nice to get that, like the older ladies, but also get the things that are happening now.
Yeah, primary school is really inclusive. Boys and girls all play together. When they go on to secondary school, it does change, but it'd be really good to get her insight. And one question that you could ask the older ladies is, what would they tell their young self now, knowing what they know? And you could feed that to her, couldn't you? But if you are limited with the number of interviews that you can do, it's a bit tricky. It is a bit tricky, but you're right, what you said, phone them up, give them an idea of how long it's going to take, and the kind of things that you want to be talking about is and know how your equipment works as well. So.
I mean, the other thing is, we've already got one lady who doesn't want to be filmed, because we film all our interviews. We don't do, I mean, we used to always do audio interviews, but now, because we quite often make them into digital stories, we like to film them, but there's one person that doesn't want to be filmed.
That is a problem. Lots of oral historians would only do it audio. If it just changes the dynamic. It changes the dynamic. The people worry about what they look like because they're on screen. You've got to get the light right. There's a lot of setup and all of those things. What you can do for someone who doesn't want to be filmed is make sure you take lots of photos, but also get photos of what they're talking about, so that you can feed the audio. You can make a digital story with the audio.
We have done that.
Those things.
But I just think we made a decision about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, that we did want to film everybody rather than just have the audio interviews. Again, we don't, if they don't want to be filmed, then we don't force them.
No. And that's where a lot of your budget will be going as well.
David, you wanted to jump in and say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, also, I feel that we've got quite an obligation to get diverse voices in these narratives, and it struck me that the history of the game is quite white, and how do we reach out to some of those diverse communities and bring those conversations in? And then I was also going to ask, kind of, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered with things like language and finding how oral history works across more diverse communities as well?
Oh, Gary, you're on mute.
That was a brilliant point I just said as well. No, what I was going to say is that in terms of diversity, yes, you're right. It is difficult when you look at the history of women's football. Most of the photographs you see, most of the stories that you see, most of the England players that you see were white quite often, and there's a class, there could be a class issue as well, which might be something to explore. Certainly I know people who've done research into women's cricket and they've talked about class, and in women's football it's a bit different, but it's something. There's no easy answer apart from your communities, and I would reach out to those communities and say to community leaders or whoever it may be, what about women's football? And obviously there are for certain ethnicities or certain religions where women playing football would be a massive topic in its own right, away from anything else. But one thing I tried to do, and it is difficult, what I tried to do is, when we got team photographs, when we managed to get hold of images from games, and it's not rocket science, but it perhaps isn't the right way to do it, but it was the best we could do at the time. If it was somebody who was clearly not a traditional white female footballer, if it was somebody with clearly a different ethnicity or whatever, I would start to ask the questions. Who is that? Do you know where they are? Can we contact them? That sort of thing. But it is difficult. I'm not going to say it's not difficult, because it certainly is. And I would say that the vast majority of women who've been interviewed over the decades about women's football are white. And so I think with this project, I think we should all try and get into those communities and ask, because there will be women who have played football within almost every community, or have been stopped from playing football. And the fact they may have been stopped from playing football in itself is important to this project, because why have they been stopped? That might be a story in its own right. So you might find that there's a girl from a certain religion or a certain ethnicity or whatever it may be, who simply was told she could not play, but she loved playing football. So know your communities and try and get into them.
Yeah, and one thing you can do there as well is go to your local newspapers and see if they've got newspaper reports, see if they've got match reports with names in them of people that you could try to find out and follow up. It might be that they've moved away, it might be that they've died. There's also all sorts of reasons why you might not be able to find them, but there might be some newspaper reports on matches. There probably aren't, because they wouldn't necessarily have been reporting on women's football. There might be.
Yep, sorry.
And one other quick point on that as well. Every region has a local football association, right? Which usually it's county based, sometimes it's city based, but usually it's county based. Talk to them, ask them, do they know of teams from particular areas, or from, and that may be a way to get in there as well. And
this is what I was saying before. You must do your research. You don't need to know all the intricacies of the sport of football, but you need to know your research around it, and you need to be, if you really particularly want to look at diversity and inclusion in women's football, then that's going to be a good place to start. You've got to be doing your research.
Diana, you wanted to say?
Oh, I would agree with both. That's how I approach it, Anita and Gary. And so did research in my archives, doing newspaper cuttings, approach our local FA, Middlesex FA, and I connected up with our local community teams and have, because the diversity of Brent is what we really wanted to reflect within these horror histories, because it's the second most diverse borough apparently in the UK. So, and a lot, for instance, I've got Fatima Hussein, who is a hijabi playing footballer, young lady footballer, and she wrote, and she, her parents didn't want to play football, and so it's that kind of story. And she's of Muslim background, so, and a Somali refugee. So it's just all of those sort of stories that we wanted to capture. And yeah, I would totally agree how that's my approach to how I did it. So.
And something else that you can do in order to find people, and I talk about this in one of the webinars that I ran for Sporting Heritage, is you can have like a conversation cafe. You can invite the local community in as a precursor to finding people to interview. So invite people in to the local ground, let's say, for coffee and cake. Tell them to bring their photographs, their memorabilia, because a lot of people will be really nervous about coming forward. If you approach them and say, oh, we'd really like to interview you, they might go, oh God, no, I can't do that. But bring them all together where they talk about their memories and they've got stuff to look at, photographs, perhaps it's in your museum or you're somewhere at the ground. Using articles sets people's memories going. So that's quite a good way. Invite the community in, talk to lots of people, get volunteers to talk to people, say, you should talk to that lady over there because she knows that person who did that thing. And that's quite a good way of finding some interviewees if you haven't already got them. Sorry, that was slightly sideways of the subject, but I think it's a good way of finding people.
Just picking up from a sporting heritage point of view, we ran a funded project last year, particularly looking at ignored history in its broader sense. And part of that was looking at different ethnicities playing sport and how it's recorded and where it sits within the sporting heritage record. And so much of it isn't recorded and has been lost. And we had a couple of researchers at academic level who were looking at how we could bridge those gaps. And they found that actually even to talk to people from different community groups, it took a long time just to build the trust. So if you are looking to record and go out into your community, just allow it to take more time, and that it's going to be different from having, maybe and this is making a terrible assumption, but a white British woman who's desperate to tell her story or would really love to tell her story because she wants to share it, to maybe somebody who has either been stopped from playing football or had a more negative experience, or doesn't understand why you want to be maybe part of what ostensibly even this year's competition will probably ostensibly be a very white competition. Why do you want my story within there? There's all those ideas around tokenism, so it's building that trust and why their story is valuable to your project, and just it putting in all that groundwork. And if there is anybody, I know that you were talking about sort of from a community engagement point of view, is that if there is somebody who can introduce you, we've quite often gone through different community leaders who can help build that trust and just allow time for it, because then that will sort of elicit the best results. I'm conscious of the time, and I know we won't force you to do proper interview practice, because I know not all of you are actually going to do interviews, but I'd quite like to put you into 3 breakout rooms of pairs just to talk about who you might interview, what sort of questions you might want to ask them, what sort of responses you're going to get, and then we'll come back and sort of discuss them as a group. And I hope that some of the things we've talked about in the first part of this session will sort of inform those, the way that you might approach that. So I'm just going to set up the rooms now. It's just going to automatically assign them.
While you're doing that, Fran, shall I just, if you think up some scenarios of people that you already know you're going to interview or would like to interview, think about their lives, think about scenarios around them, and kind of role play. Just make something up, but think about the kind of questions that you might ask that person. Might be ground staff, might be fans, might be players, might be families, mothers.
Lovely. So I'm just going to open up the breakout rooms now. For anybody who's not used breakout rooms before, you'll get an invite on your screen. If you click on it, it will whisk you away into the room, and there should be you and one other person there. Anita and Gary, if you don't click on your invites, you can stay in the main room. We'll only do it for about 5 minutes or so. So just use this opportunity to sort of bat ideas backwards and forwards between each other and what might be sort of suitable and appropriate for your project. And then we can come back together and have a discussion. So I'm just going to open the rooms now. I hope that wasn't too short a time. How did you find that? Was it useful? Yeah, so I'm gonna pick on people now, so I do apologize, but I'm going to do it anyway. So what sort of things did you discuss? So Chris and Jodie, were you together?
Yeah.
So what sort of things did you discuss when you were together?
I think we were both thinking that actually we do actually kind of know what we're doing, but actually just talking about it today has actually been quite a big confidence boost.
Good.
And we also, and this would be really interesting to hear your guys' thoughts on. I've had sort of conversations with some of the women I've talked to about feminism and where they see themselves in that, and I've had a proper kind of split response to that, and some people have got not offended but almost offended in even being characterized as a feminist from playing football as a young girl in the 70s, and others are like, absolutely, we should be kind of saying that's what we were doing. But there's a real divide, and it's real having to tread gently about that.
Yeah, I think because as younger women, we would expect everyone to have feminist views, and so we must never assume.
No.
And it's asking those questions in a way that allows the opinion to come through without leading what you think they're going to say.
Yeah, I need to practice that.
Yeah.
And also that the word itself sometimes has strong reactions from people.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those things where you want to get the stories behind it. So you perhaps do want to talk about, you know, if it's women who played during the ban, or if there was a male teacher that stopped you playing, how did you feel? And you bring out those sort of questions. I know there's somebody who did a similar project on women's cricket, and she specifically asked that question of everybody, saying, do you see yourself as a feminist? And something like 90% of the women said, absolutely not. But when the discussion would go, quite a few of them would actually say, well, the actions that we did were feminist in many ways. But yeah, that's the example how you don't want to turn somebody off with a specific question, but you do want to ease into it, perhaps.
Yeah, talk around it. And also the language that you use, they might not have used feminist.
No.
That, you know, women's lib would probably have been what they would have said. And that also had its connotations that they may agree with or disagree with. But when you delve into it, you might find that actually, yeah, they were, but they just didn't like to use the words. But it's, being careful of the language and teasing it out of people rather than leading. Were you a feminist?
Yeah.
You know,
it's also picking up on that thing that because I know you've got curatorial responsibilities as well, Jodie. As a curator, you look for those sort of patterns in history, and you can see where that fits into that. You know, you can see the meta side of it, so you can see where they fit into this bigger story. It's possible that, you know, if you're the sort of person where you don't look at how that projection is, they won't have actually even thought that they were part of that bigger story. And in the same way that you can talk to people, you can talk to sports people, and they will just know about their sport. They won't know about the rest of the history of that sport. They just know what they went and did because it's what they felt passionately about. So it's not assuming that they can see that bigger picture, because for some of them, they just wanted to play. They really wanted to play.
And others, of course,
it's no more than that.
Others will have played all sorts of different sports. They wouldn't have only played football. So, you know, they just wanted to play a sport, you know, and plenty of sports.
Yeah.
But what did everyone else have chats about?
Yeah. So who? So David and Jilly, you were together. What did you chat about?
Yeah. So we discussed the age, like the history. The oral history feels like you've got to chat to someone who has plenty of history. And you know, I went to a group of 10 sports leads in a primary school. 6 girls in a primary school, and they had a hell of a lot to say, which would have been fantastic to capture. And I think you know, the fact that I often assumed oral history to be someone older that you're sitting down and talking with, and I think there's great opportunity for us to capture some more difference in ages as well. And the other thing I wanted to ask is just some from you guys' experience of where you've seen oral histories placed really well in exhibitions, in in creative contexts where you've seen it done really well and used really well, and why?
Shall I, if you've ever been to the Imperial War Museum, oral histories fit in really, really well there. One thing you could do in your sporting context is, if you have the budget, to create listening posts in different parts of the ground, you know, perhaps if there's tours of the ground or changing rooms where people are talking about the place where they are, where that sound is being played, you see what I mean, you know, a soundscape. Or if it's in the museum, perhaps there could be people talking about, you know, the things that you can see. So yeah, there's loads of scope for soundscapes.
And talking sort of creative use, so it's another military link, and that's in the Churchill Museum. I don't know if you've been there, but they have the most amazing interactive table, or they used to. I haven't been for a few years, where it's like a card index of his life, and you can click on the different cards in the card index, and all the other cards sort of slide away, and it will either play a film or play an oral history, or it, you know, it's done really cleverly. And then they've used sort of props that then tell bits of story. So they've got a model of his family home at Chartwell, and then there's different stories that come out of the house depending on, you know, the different people, you know, bit sort of upstairs, downstairs, you know. So there's some really creative ways of doing it.
Yeah, and if you're working with schools, a nice thing to do is, I mean, I do a lot of oral history workshops with primary school children, and they're really very good at it. They're not so good at the delving deep, but they're good. They take it really seriously. But if you were working with schools with your community engagement, then you could get some of the stories and get them to use that to make a little drama for their school assembly or something like that. Use the stories that have come out to recreate a game, recreate a football match if you wanted to. I mean, there's just so many ways that you can use memories, oral history memories, or they could take on the character of the person that's speaking, you know, and be that player.
I don't know whether you've seen, sorry, we're sort of slightly going from a bit of a tangent, but I love these. I'll put the link in the chat. There's a company called Museum in a Box.
Yeah.
And it's based, I don't know if anybody's seen these. They're basically little Raspberry Pis, and it gives you a barcode, and you code your Raspberry Pi so it responds to the barcode, and you can put that barcode on anything. You can put it on an object, a photograph, and when the two barcodes are matched up, it will then play the oral history that's stored in the Raspberry Pi. So you can do some quite creative things with that, and they're really small and portable. So if you're looking at going out into the community, and they're really easy to program, they are quite popular, and every time I try and go into buy one, they're always sold out. But I'm looking at them for a project that I'm doing that's outside of sport. But yeah, so you know, the fact that you could trigger an oral history with any item, photograph, you know, you could even barcode a person if you really wanted to. But you know, you can. There's all sorts of creative sort of applications for that.
You could create a PE bag, a PE kit, you know, with football boots, but something that will trigger the sound.
Yeah. And you can have it as a standalone, or you can build it into, you know, exhibition plinths and things like that. And because they're so low cost, they're really good value. So our last pairing, Diana and Melanie, what did you talk about?
We talked about what each of us were doing, and that we also felt that we weren't interviewing enough people really to get that broad spread. I mean, I was sort of saying about interviewing obviously some older players, but some players now and within the Milton Keynes Dons ladies team, and I wanted to know if their aspiration is to be like professional footballers and earn all that big money that men earn and that women don't seem to earn so much. And that was just interesting to me.
It's just really interesting talking to each other, and just
sort of about the gender gap in pay for women, but just in general, you know, women haven't had the same opportunities to play sport, have they, over the years? I mean, I know that's changed now, but I don't. My perception is that it still hasn't changed enough. So I'd like to get the views of people who play now at a professional level to see, you know, how they feel things have changed. But
and that's very important. I mean, one of the things, just in terms of what women's football lost, just to give everyone, if you're not familiar with the way women's football sort of develops, if you like, there was a 50-year period when the game was banned for women, not just using football grounds, FA affiliated grounds, but also from men who were involved in football, from coaching or from, and people got banned for this. So if there's a 50-year ban from 1921 to roughly 1970, there's a few debates about when it actually lifted really, but anyway, if there's a 50-year ban, if that had applied to men's football, there would never have been an England 1966. Jeff Hurst, Bobby Charlton, Manchester United would never have won the European Cup in the 60s, for example, you know, or played in the 50s. So there's lots and lots of things that would have been taken out of the men's game. And so therefore, it's no wonder women's football hasn't yet reached the sort of levels and the pay and so on. But that doesn't mean it will always be like that. And it's grown enormously in the last few years. So getting those views of women playing now is absolutely vital, really, in seeing what are the aspirations. Do women see this as a career? And some of the women I interviewed, Jill Scott and Steph Houghton, for example, who are England internationals and have been, prior to them arriving in Manchester 5-6 years ago, they were still taking turns washing the kit at Sunderland or Arsenal or wherever they were. They were not full-time professionals. And so it's only in these last 5 or 6 years that it's become a professional sport. And then it is only a professional sport for a very small number of women. So it is interesting to get those aspirations. And hopefully a similar project in 20 years' time will say, wow, look how things changed in those 20 years.
I'd also like to interview some men as well to find out their views about women playing football. I was just saying to Gilly, our archive officer likes to go and watch ladies football because he says it's a nicer game to watch, a cleaner game. And he said that all the fans sit together. There's no sort of, I don't know, I mean, I just associate football matches with shouting and spitting and all this sort of stuff. And that's why I've never got involved in it. But he was saying the ladies' game is a lot nicer. So maybe I'll go to a football match.
One thing I would add, actually, it might be worth everyone just trying to go to a game.
I'm going
find a local club. It doesn't have to be in a stadium. It could be on a park pitch, but just go and watch. And I think you'll see the same level of commitment, if not greater commitment than some men, you know, by a long way. And it's just women enjoying playing football. And there's a professional side to it now, but there's also people just playing for enjoyment. But go and experience it and see it. Because again, in your interviews, you could then say, I actually, you know, I went to my first game 2 weeks ago and I saw this. Is that typical, or whatever, you know, whatever you want to get across?
Yeah. Yeah, that's great advice. Absorb how it feels, how it sounds, what it's like when your team scores a goal. You know, that huge roar. What's going on? Yeah, really good.
Lovely. Well, I'm very conscious of the time. So is there anything that anybody feels that we've not covered that you'd like to talk about in the last couple of minutes? Is there anything that we've not addressed in some of your initial?
God, we've been thorough.
Well, if that's the case, have a think, and I'll ask you one more time before we finish. But Gary and Anita, can I come to you for some sort of final closing remarks, top tips? How can we encourage everybody to go off and get the best out of their interviews?
I mean, I would say, wouldn't I? Go and watch those webinars if you need some extra help on thinking about planning your project and different ways of working them. Think about your questions. Your interview guide is not a questionnaire. So your interview guide is covering things that you want to make sure you don't forget. It's there for you if you need a helping hand, if you get stuck with some questions, but don't stick to it rigidly. It's a guide. But mainly know what your project is. Know what it is and what you want your interviews to do and what they're for. Because most of you will have a budget, most of you will only be able to do a certain number of interviews. So make sure you keep it as wide a brief as possible, but know what you're looking for.
Lovely. Gary?
support that entirely. And along the same sort of theme, really, don't go and interview 10 women who played for the same team at the same time, because you'll get the same stories, with some variations, but you get the same stories. Try and vary it, try and get people across a period of time, try and get a different, whether it is different ethnicities or different class or whatever it is, try and vary it in whatever way you can, but preferably over a period of time. Don't be afraid. Football isn't some great big mysterious world that you've got to be an actual insider to be able to ask questions. You don't. The best questions can come from somebody who knows nothing at all about football. You're interviewing people about something people enjoy doing, or maybe they don't enjoy it. That might be another angle. But don't be afraid, and I think you'll all get something significant out of this, and you'll all gain something. So just enjoy it.
Yeah, and if you've got volunteers that are going to be doing the interviews for you, or you've got volunteers involved in your project, I would suggest getting some professional oral history training for them, because it is, for somebody who's never done it before, it is intimidating. Can be, depends on the person, of course, but get some professional training in there, because then you will get better interviews.
Lovely, thank you for you both. And I'll just finish on going back to always what we were talking about at the beginning. Just, I think from what everybody was saying at the beginning and picking up what Gary was saying, try and exploit your outsider position. Really draw out that knowledge from your interviewees and ask. There's no such thing, I don't think, as a daft question in an oral history interview, because you just don't know where that question is going to take you, and just make sure that you listen in detail to the answer, because it could be those tangents that elicit those really rich questions. So see football as sort of that vehicle, the lens through which you can look at all sorts of topics that will allow you to explore sort of the challenges and the change that's happened and the impact of women's football over this century. I think that's we've covered quite a lot of ground there. Thank you so much for taking part in this afternoon's session. I will send round a follow-up email that will have the link to this recording in it, and also the link to all the things that were shared in the chat. If anybody has any other questions, do come back and ask us. I'm sure Gary and Anita, I haven't asked them, so I'm going to put them on the spot now. If you're happy to have your contact details shared, I will include those as well. And yeah, best of luck with your interviews. I look forward to seeing some of the final results. Lovely. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.